everyone. This is Puya Hamami, healthcare analyst at Edison. And today we have with us two senior executives at Pixium Vision, an emerging medtech company in the restorative vision and neuromodulation space. Lloyd Diamond is the CEO of Pixium Vision, and Offer Nonhoff is its new chief financial officer. Hello, Lloyd and Offer. It's great to have you join us and to provide an update on Pixium Vision and how it's advancing the Prima bionic vision system, and how right now it's a truly exciting time for the company now that Prima is in registration enabling pivotal studies. So first of all, what are the potential benefits of Prima compared to other treatments in development for atrophic macular degenerations? Namely, how would a retinal implant device can provide vision restoration even as the underlying causes of the disease and loss of photoreceptors can be multifactorial?
Puya, thanks for inviting us to speak to you today about Prima. As you said, it's an exciting technology. I think maybe the best way for me to answer that question is first to state that it's not really a subject that really demands a comparison, because for dry AMD there really isn't any other comparative therapy today. As you know, and probably the listeners know, there's quite a few drug trials that are currently underway, and they look at approaching the dry AMD disease cascade in different manners. I know they're looking at anti-VEGF, similar treatments for wet AMD as for dry. They're looking at gene therapy and other therapies that really have a primary objective of intervening early in the disease stage. But as you also are aware, with dry AMD, the initial what I would say the initial what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, the initial symptoms. The initial symptoms don't necessarily show themselves early on, so it's kind of hard to intervene early in the disease. So let's put the comparison topic aside for a second, since there is nothing really for us to compare to. With respect to retinal implantations, there is a bit of history around retinal implantation and retinal devices that really started back in the late 80s, early 90s, with the primary target being retinitis pigmentosa, which is also a retinal dystrophy, different than dry AMD. It manifests itself differently as well. But there were some early devices in trial, and some even were approved, including one from Pixium that was called Iris. The point around retinal implants and retinitis pigmentosa is that typically those devices were considered epiretinal implants. So the way the technology worked is they were sort of external to the retina, not in the subretinal space, very different than our device, Prima. And also they intervened in disease that was relatively small in number. In fact, you can kind of consider retinitis pigmentosa almost an orphan. It's considered minimally invasive. It can be done in an outpatient setting in a relatively short period of time. Yeah.
So in late 2020, the company started its PRIMAvera pivotal study. And so please remind us, what is the primary endpoint, and how does the data from the European feasibility study to date, how does that provide confidence in meeting the PRIMAvera primary endpoints?
Yeah, so the PRIMAvera pivotal study is a study that will take place in 38 patients in several centers in Europe and in several countries. We can, of course, address that a bit later. The primary endpoint is improvement in visual acuity as measured by ETDRS letter reading test. And in order to have a successful trial where we meet the endpoint, 71% of the patients need to have an improvement of 2 lines or greater on an ETDRS chart. Now, the second part of your question, which I actually think is even more interesting than the first, is what gives us the confidence that we will have a successful trial and meet the primary endpoint in PRIMAvera. And that is that the study design was really based on 2 earlier feasibility studies that we have conducted. One is in France on 5 patients, which is now coming up on its 36-month endpoint. And the other is the US study, which is also a feasibility study, which is much earlier in its progress. But in any event, in those studies, we also measure improvement in visual acuity as well. And we know that the data that we published from our French phase 2 study, 18 to 24-month data, actually showed that we had an average of 5 lines of improvement. So, well beyond the 2-line minimum that we need to reach in the larger pivotal study.
It's very exciting. And so the PRIMAvera study, I believe it started in the Rothschild Hospital in Paris, I believe. But I think there's been some news recently on site expansion, including at the world-renowned Moorfields Hospital. Please let us know how many sites and countries are now involved with PRIMAvera.
Yes, so the PRIMAvera study will cover the primary countries. So it includes France, the UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands. We've reported that we have already implanted our first patient starting in France, and we've received approval from MHRA to begin our study in the UK. So as we progress with country approvals, we of course will announce publicly to the markets as those fall in line. What I can say is that even in spite of the COVID pandemic, the regulatory authorities have been quite cooperative with Pixium in kind of helping us navigate through the process, including the new medical device regulation, the new MDR that has been put in place since the end of May of this year in Europe. As I stated, our ambition is to have broad coverage in the largest countries in Europe, because it will make sense that when we discuss commercialization, I think in a bit, that we conducted trials in the larger countries within Europe. It'll just facilitate the commercial rollout of the technology later.
And how is the study ongoing? Has there been much challenges because of COVID, or has been good interest from patient advocacy groups and other aspects as well?
Yeah, so definitely amongst patient advocacy groups, and maybe I should take a step back and say, before we actually chose the countries and the centers, Pixium did quite a bit of work with several patient advocacy groups across Europe and the US, where we were really trying to understand from patients that had advanced forms of macular degeneration, what exactly does their disability entail? Where are their concerns around their current illness, and what would they expect from a technology as far as vision restoration to give them a satisfactory level of vision restoration? So ahead of the PRIMAvera study, I'd say about a year ahead, the company did quite a bit of diligence in developing relationships with the major patient advocacy groups in Europe. That being said, as far as progressing through the PRIMAvera study, the challenges that we've had, of course, there are always challenges associated with studies, are not necessarily a lack of interest of patients. In fact, the target patient population, I think, is even larger than we had originally thought, in that we have quite a few patients undergoing screening. However, as probably the viewers will know, that in Europe, vacation time from June to August is an important time, because people take their vacations. And what I would say this year, because people have been locked up essentially for the last 2 years, what all the patients have said that have shown interest is, we're interested in your study, but we're not going to be implanted prior to summer break, because we want our vacation, and then when we come back, then we can progress in the study. So that's one. I'd say there's a slight delay in timing, but not a lack of interest, and certainly not a lack of patients that are currently in the screening process. That's the first point. The second point I would mention is, because of the new medical device regulation, so in Europe before they had the medical device directive, the MDD, now we have the MDR, there was, I think, some confusion amongst each of the countries' competent authorities around the dossier acceptance criteria in order to be able to receive the dossier and then begin the process of granting approval to begin the study. Now, we had an advantage on one hand at Pixium because as a class 3 device, even though we were under the medical device directive before, we essentially were compliant with most of the medical device regulation rules. So that change didn't really have an impact on the way that we developed our dossier to submit for approval. However, on the regulatory and notified body side in the countries, they had delays in receiving the dossier. But I'm happy to say that, that maybe was a couple of months in delay, but as you've seen now, France is approved, Germany is underway, UK has just been approved. So we're starting to see the countries now fall in line, which of course will help us accelerate enrollment in the study.
Oh, that's very good. And so overall, in terms of the timing, when do you expect to complete enrollment and to have top line data? And I guess relating to that, when do you expect to actually submit the CE mark application and potentially even start commercializing Prima?
So what we've announced publicly to the markets is our target to finish enrollment is the end of 2022. At this, let me back up. The end of 2021. I want to make sure I'm clear. Sorry, the end of 2021, and that we would then have 12 months follow-up, and that we would then be submitting data sometime the end of 2022 into early 2023 at the 12-month follow-up mark, where then we would submit the data to the competent authorities for approval and eventual CE mark. On the enrollment side right now, that's still the objective for the company, is to finish by the end of 2021, the enrollments. However, the implantations then will go into early 2022. And that means that we would have data readout sometime in early 2023. Oh. At this point, we're not changing our guidance on that. We still have 5 months, I guess, left before the end of the year. Once vacation period is over, we'll know more as far as the cadence of enrollment. Now, that being said, our target being to submit sometime into early 2023, the CE mark, we could receive approval as early as the end of 2023, which is what we've announced to the markets, or depending on how long it takes for the competent authority to review the dossier. And remember now, with the medical device regulation, you have to go before an expert panel committee that would be an expert panel on ophthalmology, so that they can also give an opinion on the validity of the study. That's new. That didn't exist under the MDD. So depending on how long that takes, that may have a delay or not, in the process. But right now, we'd say end of 2023 into early 2024, we would expect to have commercial approval in Europe.
Okay. And let's talk a bit about the commercialization of Prima. I think you touched on this earlier, but what are the main countries that you're targeting in Europe? And effectively, how does the Pixium expect to handle the manufacturing and supply requirements and the supply chain effectively? Does it expect to engage a commercial partner, or does the company plan on market Prima on its own? And what are the main advantages of your chosen marketing strategy?
Yeah, so as far as the countries, it's the typical big five. We of course won't ignore the rest, but France, it's our home country. Germany is the largest in Europe. The UK has one of the largest retinal centers in Europe at Moorfields. Italy, Spain, the Netherlands. So we'll start in the countries where we're conducting the trial. Makes the most sense because those major centers will have the most experience with the technology. Also, from a commercial rollout perspective, it also makes sense because as those centers in those countries will have been familiar with, or will be familiar with Prima, then the burden on Pixium to support the commercial launch is somewhat lowered, right? And as you know, implementing and launching a new technology in the medical device world can be heavily commercially intensive. So those are the primary countries. As far as partner or not, we believe that the Prima system is unique enough, and it is really a breakthrough technology that, at least at initial launch, we would not find a better partner to commercialize the technology than Pixium itself. And so our plan would be focus on the major centers in the countries I mentioned in Europe, ensure that there's good traction in those major centers, ensure that there's not only not only a breadth of adoption, but depth of adoption in each of those centers as well, and to ensure very good clinical outcomes. That's the most important, we think, criteria to ensuring a successful launch. But eventually, as Prima, gains acceptance, and we would move out into other centers outside the major centers where we start selling, then it may make sense to look at either a partnership model or a hybrid model where we would provide clinical support and then a commercial partner would be responsible for selling the technology. So that's on as far as commercial launch and partnerships go. And then I think there was a third part. Sorry, there was another part to your question.
Talking about the supply chain and the manufacturing.
Yeah. So of course, as we're currently in a clinical stage, the demands on manufacturing are very much limited to the pivotal study. But that being said, in order to support a 38 patient pivotal study, let's just say for math 40, we'll make it easy, you need to be able to manufacture between 80 and 100 systems, right? Because you have to make sure that the systems are reliable, and if there's a problem, you can get one out to the patients quickly. So in a way, we're sort of scaling now because we needed to scale for the pivotal study. That being said, we outsource a lot of the manufacturing today. There is, however, one component that we will continue to maintain control over in manufacturing, and that is the computer and processor itself, because that's where we house the algorithms, and that's where the magic really takes place. Right. That's on the externals. As far as the implant is concerned, we also work with two key manufacturers externally that could do an excellent job, and they have a lot of capacity to spin up as demand increases. But the finishing process really will still take place here at Pixium. So we have an environment here now. We are kind of moving from a prototype into a manufacturing phase, but only for the key core components that are proprietary to us. The rest will continue to enhance our partnerships with outside suppliers.
Oh, that's very helpful. And going a bit back to the commercialization point, has there ever been any discussion yet on reimbursement with any of the European authorities or agencies, or is it a bit too premature for that?
So indirectly, so regarding Prima and dry-AMD, no. But as I mentioned before, and talking about the history of retinal implants, Pixium does have quite a bit of experience in negotiating reimbursement for iris epiretinal implant, which was used for retinitis pigmentosa. And so when I say for Prima, we haven't directly, the company actually has a precedent in reimbursement for iris. And so what does that mean? It means that we understand the envelope and the willingness to pay both in the US and in Europe, as there has been reimbursement established in the area of retinal implantation. For retinitis pigmentosa, it was between €100,000 and $150,000 per patient implanted. And so we know the envelope. We understand the health economic data that the payers will require to be able to grant specific reimbursement for Prima. And in developing our PRIMAvera pivotal study, we ensured that the data that we capture, although maybe not primary endpoint or even secondary endpoints, includes cost, time, and other sorts of economic data that payers will expect to see in order to grant definitive reimbursement.
And let's switch over a little bit to the US market, because the company has communicated that it wants to try to bridge the PRIMAvera study in a way that it could be eligible to be used by the FDA as part of the dossier or the data required for potential US PMA or registration application. So how is the progress on this front? And do you believe that PRIMAvera could alone be sufficient to fulfill US registration requirements, or would another US study be needed?
So we started already the discussions with the FDA pre-COVID. So this has been going on now for 18 months roughly. And we have a good sense of what the FDA will require from a data perspective, because in the negotiations we undertook with the FDA for our phase 2 in the US, they were very actually prescriptive and cooperative, and they actually offered quite a bit of insight into what pivotal data they would need. So in a way, the textbook in a way is written. Now, where we're in the process right now is of negotiating and pushing back perhaps on some of the requests, just because, not because we disagree with what the FDA is asking, but because at the time the FDA was putting those requests in place to us, they did not yet have data from our European feasibility work. So we believe that we've already answered some of their questions with the data set that's coming up on 36 months in the French patient study. Data around safety and some efficacy endpoints. So of course, then COVID hit. The FDA was not granting pre-sub meetings if they were not directly related to the COVID, pandemic. And they've just now started once again to sort of open themselves back up on the device side to start hearing pre-sub, as reviewing pre-sub applications and granting pre-sub meetings. So what our plan is before the end of this year to go through the pre-sub process so that we can then answer the questions they have, provide the data that we have from France and also from the US, because we have patient data now from 2 patients at least in the US, which we haven't reported on, and we won't report yet until we get to certain milestones. But nonetheless, we have a data set that we can bring back to the FDA. And then the discussion, which will answer the second part of your question, will be around accepting a 38-patient pivotal study from Europe, 5 patients in France, 5 patients eventually in the US. So will a 48-patient data set be sufficient to answer the questions that the FDA will have and give them enough comfort to grant us PMA approval? By the way, and the plan is to do that through a breakthrough device designation process, because we believe that we fit the 3 criteria, right, for breakthrough device designation. So that being said, then we would create that argument. Now, I can't speculate on how successful I believe our discussion will be with the FDA around having the 48 patients fulfill all of their requirements. Typically, the FDA has not been specific. They say they're open to it, but they typically won't grant on non-US data. I mean, it's hard for a new technology to do so. But I think at a minimum, what we could argue is that a small investigational study to complement the data that we provide them would be reasonable. So we're not talking about a complete new pivotal study. I think that would be unreasonable for them to ask, but certainly complementary data that may look again at confirming safety and maybe some other efficacy endpoints could be reasonable.
And do you anticipate, I mean, maybe early on, but do you anticipate that the commercial approach in the US will be similar to that in Europe?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, very much so. Because we will, well, we are working with 2 centers currently on the feasibility study. We may open that up to more. Certainly, if we do an investigational study, we'll open up some more centers. And so then you'll have, a nice, some nice hubs in the United States of major retinal centers, which would be just the logical partners for, to become eventually to become customers of the technology. And then little by little, same thing, we would begin to expand out directly and then eventually perhaps through some partnership.
So let's talk a little bit about the company's financial position. So Pixium recently reported about 10 million euros in gross cash at the end of June, and it subsequently raised, I think, about 8 million in equity financing. So will these funds be sufficient to bring Pixium to the primary endpoint data for PRIMAvera? And if so, what additional activities do you expect that the funding will support at Pixium?
Sure. Hi, Puya, first of all. Nice to meet you and to have the ability here to speak to you. In principle, yes, the funds which you mentioned, that we had reported on the 30th of June and that we raised within the month of July should be sufficient to cover all the way through the end of 2022. And as Lloyd mentioned, we expect data for PRIMAvera end of 2022, beginning of 2023. So we should be covered. And to your second part of the question, it will, of course, furthermore fund, our ongoing R&D work that we're doing on, future generations of the product, in stabilizing, the product to be able to be, produced in greater tranches, prepare for mass production, so to say. And then also, some exciting other new products which might connect us to the patients, in a remote facility, which we haven't spoken yet in detail about, but could be a very interesting technology to connect the patient, create more patient satisfaction, and to connect this, of course, then to the surgeon and to Pixium.
And I'm relating to this, I believe, that is it possible that further funding may be needed by the end of 2022 or around that time frame to support the launch activities in Europe? Would that be safe to say?
Yes, it will support launch and, of course, then also regulatory approval in the US.
And actually, going back to the US, the company has described it in the past, it has plans to obtain a US listing. So what are the main drivers for obtaining a US listing, and how do you see it benefiting Pixium? What pathways are being considered for a US listing? Is it IPO, reverse merger? What are the aspects of and the opportunities that we can envision for this?
Yeah, first let me start off by saying, we haven't taken a decision in this respect yet. We're really studying all the various avenues you've mentioned, whether this be a reverse merge, a dual listing, certain opportunities within the SPAC space, and we're really trying to do the best here for Pixium in regards to the future financing of the company, preparing the grounds for that.
So if we look a few years forward and we assume that the Prima becomes a success and it reaches the market, what should we then be looking at as the next steps for Pixium? Can we imagine Pixium going into developing Prima for other areas of retinal disease, such as RP, retinitis pigmentosa, or are there other sorts of technologies that we can expect that Pixium will look into in the areas of neuromodulation?
Yeah, so first let me take a little bit of a step back and sort of rebound on what Offer said before around funding sort of future development. So, ophthalmology is the core. Neuromodulation and ophthalmology is really what we know how to do. We know how to do well. We've set ourselves up with the top researchers in the field around the world. Our agreement with Stanford on the development side, it's a very close agreement, and it's all centered around neuromodulation and ophthalmology. So that's really where we will focus. And so, but maybe not just, when we talk about development, I don't want to just think about it in terms of the implant and the externals. We need to really discuss about expanding the capabilities of the technology within the primary indication. And so Offer mentioned, it's something that we've touched on, but we can imagine that as we communicate between the outside world and the implant inside the patient, there's also an ability for us to expand that communication so that we can actually help the patients remotely. Think about telehealth, think about the applications around remote diagnostic, remote rehabilitation, following the patients, especially in the post-pandemic world where who knows what the next variant will be, and who knows how our patient population, will they be able to come back to the hospitals? How will we ensure that they have proper rehabilitation post-implantation to benefit and maximize the use of the system? So that's sort of one area that we are moving down, and stay tuned. We'll make probably some announcements around that. Now, that being said, expanding indications would of course be next on the list. And retinitis pigmentosa, it's where the company started. We know that disease well. We have a much better technology now. It would only make sense that that would be the next indication for us. We'd have to do some initial preliminary studies with a wireless implant in the subretinal space, but there's no reason why at this point we would assume that it wouldn't work. And then Stargardt's disease is another one. So any retinal degenerative disease where the photoreceptor cells are not functioning and the optic nerve is intact, why not? And then answering the third part of your question around expanding into other neuromodulation fields, you know, of course, it would make sense. I mean, you know, as many of the viewers probably know, and as you know yourself, we have the head of Europe from Medtronic that sits on our board. They're the worldwide leader in neuromodulation. Of course, there are conversations around where can you take the technology, but that's not something I think we would develop on our own. So the message that I want to give and that I've given to the organization is we are hyper-focused on executing in neuromodulation and ophthalmology, with the first indication being dry AMD. Let's get that right. It's a plenty big potential market, and then we can see expanding into the other retinal dystrophies, and then maybe in a partnership outside of ophthalmology.
And in looking at again at the Prima again, in the past, the company has described some research into developing higher electrodensity Prima implant chips that could provide maybe even higher resolution and perhaps even expand the AMD market that you're looking at. Should we expect to hear some further news on this front or some progress in terms of the chips? Yeah,
I mean, you know, again, you know, our relationship with Stanford is such that, and the Hansen Physics Lab there, and Daniel Palanker, and the, you know, Bayer's Eye Clinic and all of that. I mean, of course, they have an interest in pushing the art forward. We're always looking at new types of implants, you know, more pixels in implants, different shapes of implants, you know, anything that we can do to increase the potential cellular stimulation at the ganglion cell level, for instance, you know, all of, you know, anything we can do to enhance the performance of the implant. So yes, of course, and that relationship is strong and development work is ongoing with them. You know, if we continue to do our jobs right, which we think we are, then there will be further developments in the space. That being said, we don't believe that we fully maximize the performance of the current implant we have.
Right.
And as I've said all along, I think we've discussed this, you've published on it, and I've presented this also in other forums, is that, you know, we believe that we can still get better performance out of the current implant by improvements in algorithms and the interface between the externals and our implant itself. And so I would expect that you would also see some announcements, you know, around that as we move forward in our development.
That's right, to further maximize the current implant, because there's still more potential. I think we expressed that in the past. So overall, this sounds like a very exciting time period for Pixium, especially as you're going through the pivotal study, and the recruitment should be finishing in the next several months. So overall, in closing, what are some of the key catalysts and milestones that investors should be looking for over the next 12 months or so for Pixium?
Yeah, the key milestones definitely are going to be, you know, the PRIMAvera study and completing enrollment. Along the line, there's going to be, of course, announcement on further countries, which we're going to be opening up, and that, you know, is the next, 18 months, I would say. We have 36 months follow-up of our feasibility study here in France, which we hopefully going to announce in Q4 this year, maybe end of Q3. I think these are the big events.
And then also I maybe add to the progress in our US feasibility study as well. Mm-hmm. So there are probably 4 or 5 key milestones coming up here over the next year or so that will really be pivotal, not just a pivotal study, but pivotal for Pixium. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. No, that's great. So thank you very much, Lloyd and Offer, for joining us today. And viewers can consult the Edison website for access to our equity research and further research on the company. Thank you again very much.
Thanks, Puya. Appreciate it.
Thank you.